It was the French gamble that now threatens to turn the country's political order on its head. President Emmanuel Macron called snap parliamentary elections following the European Parliament results a few weeks ago, and now the country is coming to terms with accepting the inevitability of a far-right wing. So, what does this mean for the country, for Europe, and beyond? That's our topic this week. I'm Erdem Koch.
And I'm Ozan Ibrisim.
Welcome to Put Simply. Ozan, good to be back on Put Simply, and well, by far the biggest news over the last week has been the outcome of the first US presidential election debate. And, well, you've had a change of perspective in terms of how you see the presidential race will now play out. What's going through your mind?
Well, we do our best to kind of not talk too much about the US elections and kind of, monopolize our time on it. But it's one of those things that you kind of try and escape it, but it keeps pulling you back in. So, look, globally, I think it's the biggest topic, biggest issue. And, having things like the New York Times editorial the next day calling for Biden to end it and drop out, this is hugely significant, and I think it's caught global headlines. On a personal note, I have to say I've gone from defending President Biden, and his chances. I've had many conversations and discussions with people who have been telling me that Trump's going to win again, and I held hope. And the main reason for that is predominantly the unpopularity of now convicted felon, former President Trump, and the fact that President Biden had 5 months to effectively, or 4 months or 6 months, whenever I was having the conversation, to effectively make the case. Now, the case that he needed to make was that he was capable of first and foremost running a campaign, and then being able to do the job of president. And I have to say, I held a very strong view that he could do both until about the 4th minute of the debate. And I was watching it on my phone in the queue to board a plane, and I think I was very loud when I said, "Oh shit, he's gone," because I think he had one job, and that was to put in a good enough effort, performance in that debate to not just persuade or convince people that he was fit to be the nominee, but also ensure that the media didn't do what it has done and go on this whole circus around whether he should run or not. He needed to put in a bland, insignificant performance, but one that kind of allowed the media to get on with reporting on how bad President Trump's performance was. And I don't think I've seen a debate or in anywhere around the world somebody going up and just lying at every opportunity they had. So President Trump also had a horrible debate, but optics, I think, are important. We live in a world where we think that people are kind of not paying attention to this stuff. People have become desensitized to this stuff, and that's true until you shock them into kind of getting out of their comatose state. And the debate had that impact, I think, because I think people weren't expecting much, but they certainly had a rude awakening when they saw the performance of President Biden and saw that he was really struggling.
Welcome to November last year, Ozan. That's what I was thinking, and that's where I was at. For me, I am genuinely perplexed of how the Democrats have even let it come to this point. I mean, it has been so clear now for so long that President Biden's mental, physical health is on the decline and has been on the decline for some time. Why on earth did they wait to have these discussions after the first debate in July for a November election? I mean, we're seeing the backgrounding of journalists now. We're seeing major newspapers reporting things like, the Obamas are coming out against Biden and serious Democrat heavyweights are coming out against Biden. Why is it that they were not having these conversations on what it would look like to potentially have him not run, much, much, much earlier on. There was this whole thinking in the Democratic camp, and they were briefing journalists about this over the last year, really, that Biden is the only person in history to beat Trump, and therefore he is the only person in history who could beat Trump. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. I don't think there's a shortage of talent in the Democrats. And I think what could have happened is someone else step up. Now, whether that someone else is Vice President Kamala Harris and there's problems around her and how she sort of resonates with voters, I don't know. The question now is, I think, what do the battleground states think? Those key states that we all keep our eye on in November, what are they thinking? And what is the impact of the debate going to be on them? Because if they start to swing against Biden to the point where the polls are now saying that it's going to be a bit of a wipeout for the Dems, Jesus Christ, I don't know what they do from here on in. But I'm curious as to what you think. I mean, what does happen from here on in?
Look, I think I agree with you. I think this should have been dealt with earlier, but at the same time, they had a process whereby other candidates could have come in. Now, I understand why other candidates may not challenge a sitting president. One tried and he got nowhere. It's somewhat difficult as to what they could have, or to kind of talk about what they could have done, because Biden put his hat in the ring and he got overwhelming support in the primaries in a lot of those key states, etc. This is important because I've heard many commentators talking about, including the Biden campaign, about how it's important to see how the voters, assess the performance of Biden in the debate, and the opinion polls will kind of show a way forward as to whether Biden should stay in the race or not. But here's the problem with that thinking. The opinion polls haven't changed much. They've been pretty tight for the last 12, 18, 24 months. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that people are cemented in. Are there going to be a lot of Democrats, or anti-Trump people who are going to change their vote because of this? I don't think so. So I think what you're going to see in terms of the movements in the polls over the next week or so, I don't think is all that reflective of what those people who are going to be key in those battleground states that you talked about are going to do in November. So I think I really worry that, if the movement is very small, then that's going to give the Biden campaign a false sense of security to say, hey, look, the debate performance didn't make a huge impact on President Biden's support. I just don't think that's true. I think it's very difficult to move those polls. It's so polarized. Everyone's in their own tribes. You asked me whether President Biden can win. In my opinion, it's going to take a lot of effort from here if he remains the nominee. I mean, he has to change a perception that's been there for the last 2 years over the next 5 months, enough to convince key battleground state swing voters to vote for him. Running as a candidate, I think, is a very different job to being president, and it requires, I think, a lot more energy, a lot more. There's a lot more scrutiny on you, and I'm just not convinced that he can do it. So, coming back to my earlier point, he's got a mountain to climb, and I'm not sure he's able to climb that mountain. And as you said, you and I have had this conversation for some time, but I guess, like many other people, I was not, I wasn't fully aware of how difficult it was for him, or it is for him, to kind of fulfill the very basic roles that he needs to fulfill in a campaign. Now, he was great at the rally afterwards, and there could be an argument to be made that maybe he was very nervous. He knew that the stakes were high at the debate, but then the next day he went to a rally in North Carolina and he was back to himself. Yes, you could make that argument, but he's got to have 5 or 6 of those rallies every day, and I'm not sure he's capable of. It's sad to say, I don't think he's capable of doing that, and that's what is required, if you ask me, to kind of win. But what are the options? People who know this stuff much better than I do have made comments around it, but at the end of the day, the conclusion that everyone comes down to is it's Biden's decision to make. Nobody can challenge him unless he says, I'm stepping down, considering that he's gone through a primary. He's got a whole bunch of delegates who are committed to him at the convention. So he has to get rid of. So he has to step down, and he has to say, "Look, I want my delegates to vote for X candidate," which is most likely going to be Kamala Harris, you would think. But then that brings up a whole bunch of other questions that we probably need a whole podcast to discuss around her problems with the electorate and her unfavorability levels, etc.
Honestly, I think the Democrats are doomed either way. I think Trump is too good of a communicator, despite the criminal convictions and despite the mistruths that he spoke in the presidential campaign. I think if the Dems stick with Biden, they're in trouble. I think if they replace Biden and, it's not Harris, even though I think she's got her own problems, as you said, and they bring in someone else, then I think, again, they're doomed. I mean, and maybe that's the thinking. Maybe the thinking is, look, this will be Trump's last term. Give it to him. Give us 4 years to rebuild the party, and then come in with a stronger candidate. Who knows? I don't know. But it'll clearly be a conversation that we'll keep having between now and November. Let's cross the Atlantic now, though, and head over to France, where voters have just completed the first round of snap parliamentary elections. Our guest this week is Natanael Bloch, a media commentator and analyst. He has worked with business leaders, governments, and organisations across Australia, France, and Europe in numerous sectors. He joins us from Paris this week here on Put Simply. Natanael, welcome to Put Simply. Could you start by introducing yourself and explaining what you do, please?
I've been a political advisor for Sarkozy's government, and more precisely the Ministry of Health, for a couple of years. I also run some campaigns at different levels, regional, national, and European ones. And when I'm not working in politics, I work in corporate communication and public affairs. So still very linked to what happened in the political world. Living in Australia at the moment, I've also worked in politics there as an advisor for former minister. And I try to do my best to explain how French/European politics works. So it's a very interesting moment because we have a lot of things happening, both in France, but also in the EU world at the moment.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to ask you to do for us here today, Nat. The first round of the snap parliamentary elections are over after President Macron called them following the European Parliament results a few weeks ago. Before we get into the details of this particular election, could you please outline for us and paint a bit of a picture of some of the issues in France over the past few years, particularly under President Macron's reign, and where the country sort of stands from an economic and socio-political perspective?
To understand a bit the issue of the last couple of years, I think we have to go back to the original promise of Emmanuel Macron when he made his first campaign prior to the 2017 election. One of the things he wanted is to kind of break the classic game in politics in France between the right and the left. The whole thing of at that time En Marche, which is now Renaissance, is to say that solutions brought by the right, the conservative, and solutions brought by the socialist, labor on the other side do not work anymore, and we need people from both spectrum, but also people from the civil society to be able to bring new solutions to the issues that France is facing. And that was the original promise by Emmanuel Macron in 2017. And in a certain way, he was successful in that because he kind of really completely, broke the classic system between right and left. And why I'm explaining that? I'm explaining that because it means also that for him, solutions do not have to be from one side. They can come from both sides. And I just give a couple of examples on the social aspect of things. Emmanuel Macron's solutions were quite aligned with what the socialists did in the last couple of years in France. You have to remember that the same-sex wedding, for example, is quite recent and has been adopted by the socialist president François Hollande, and Emmanuel Macron get one step further in terms of adoption by the same-sex wedding people, in terms of everything related to the rights of minority. From the economic perspective, Emmanuel Macron probably took more solutions from the right and probably put himself more into the legacy of Nicolas Sarkozy, the French president from 2007 to 2012. Why? Because he just wanted to, create a more, I would say, free ecosystem in terms of economy, in terms of labor. For example, make things easier for employers if they want to get rid of employees. He wants also to completely change the way that the pension system is working, the way of the unemployment system is working in France, because in the last couple of years, everyone saw that what we have in terms of both pension and an employment system is not sustainable anymore. That was, for example, a big thing, a big issue that the French society is facing. And Emmanuel Macron tried in the last couple of years to bring the best of both worlds. So that's one aspect of the thing. The second aspect of the issues that France was facing in the last couple of years was, I would say, the increasing feeling of unsafety that did not begin with Emmanuel Macron. It was already the case under Nicolas Sarkozy. It probably increased under François Hollande with the terrorist attack. And Emmanuel Macron also tried to bring solution both at the French but also EU level in terms of safety, in terms of answers regarding immigration. This is also something that if you take the latest polls for French people, there are two main things that French people are worried about. The first one is everything regarding economy, the inflation and the answers that the French president can bring to that, to the cost of life. And the second one is immigration, safety, and in a certain way also what could be France's answer into a world where everything is interconnected, and above all in the EU world where, as you probably know, it's a free borders world, free transportation of goods, but also persons. So I would say that's what France was facing in the last couple of years and under Emmanuel Macron's presidency.
Nat, for those who may not be aware, could you put simply what the political system looks like in France? So what are the roles of the parliament? I understand the parliament is what the French electors are being asked to elect over the next 2 weeks, or over last week and next week. What are the roles of the parliament, government, and president?
So in France, we have a system with what we call three different powers. We have the political power. So the political is the government. We have the parliament, and we have the justice. In terms of both political and parliament, it's what we call a presidential system. Some even call him a hyper presidential system. So in France, in fact, everyone elects the president. It used to be every 7 years. Now it's every 5 years. So every 5 years, French people go to vote to elect their president. It's an election when you vote for one person, and the two first after the first round go to a second round, and French people go back to vote, and the one who gets the majority is elected president. So that's about the president. Regarding the parliament, it's a bit different, and this is what we have at the moment. It's the legislative election, so people go to vote. It's also a two rounds system. They go and they vote also in their constituency. They still vote for a person, but everyone who gets more than 12.5% of the votes, in fact, more precisely, 12.5% of the number of people who are registered in the constituency go to the second round. So it means that for the legislative election in your constituency, you can have 2 candidates at the second round, but you can also have 3 and sometimes 4 candidates. Only the candidates who get more than 50% after the first round are directly elected member of parliament. For example, in this legislative election, you have already 80 candidates who get more than 50% in their constituency, and they have been elected already MEPs. And so we vote for the MEPs also for 5 years. Why? Because in doing that, we think that in having both the presidential and the legislative election, and I'm not talking about a dissolution, I'm talking in normal time, when you vote for both at approximately at the same time, one is in May, one is in June, usually, it means that you have the same political color, because usually when you vote for something in May, let's say the right party, if you go and vote for the MEP in June, you will also vote for the right party. So you have an alignment in terms of the president and the MEPs, so it's easier to govern. So that's for the MEPs. Something that is very different in France compared to other parliamentary regime is that it's not, the government is not, I would say, picked up among the MEPs who have been elected. It's the president himself. That's what we call him a presidential or super presidential system. It's the president who appoints a prime minister. And when he appoints a prime minister, he doesn't have to appoint someone who have been elected. He can appoint anyone. So you have the case where sometimes a prime minister has never been elected. If you take a couple of years back, Jacques Chirac appointed Dominique de Villepin, who is the French prime minister who say no to the war in Iraq, if you remember. Dominique de Villepin has never been elected, but he was a very important civil servant, and Jacques Chirac wanted to appoint him. So the president, when he's elected, he appoints the prime minister, and then the prime minister appoints the French government. And same thing, the French government is composed of people who do not have to be elected and MEPs. They can appoint anyone to be Minister of Foreign Affairs, of Domestic Affairs, and so and so. If he appoints someone who is MEP, the MEP has to resign from his MEP role, because you can't be in France both MEP and member of the government at the same time, and there will be another MEP for the constituency. So in fact, it's a very interesting system. When French people elect a president, French people elect their MEPs, but it's the president who has this incredible power to appoint a prime minister, and then both president and the prime minister appoint a government. And once again, same thing, the idea is that the president appoints a prime minister and they appoint together a government of the same political color. So it means that you have a president, a government, and an assembly who can do a good work together, I would say, because they have the same objective, they come from the same side, and so and so. And here, with what we have, it's very interesting because obviously with the dissolution, both calendars are a bit now separate, because Emmanuel Macron is still president, and he is still president for 3 more years, but we may elect an assembly from a different political color, with different political objectives and so and so. So it can make things more complicated for everyone to govern and decide, because there is not this alignment that you usually have in the French political system.
So does that mean then if, for example, a political party of a different color to President Macron is elected, he can still veto that the leader of that political party, for example, being prime minister?
So we already had this case in 1997 when Jacques Chirac also decided to do a dissolution. At that time, he said that he wants a stronger majority at the parliament. So he said, I'm dissolving. I want French citizens to go back for another vote because I want more MEPs of my side. Unfortunately, it did not happen like that. And French people chose to elect people from left. So we had at that time a president from the right, conservative, and an assembly plus a government from the left. The president, there is no rule written, sorry, there is no rule written in the constitution that he has to appoint a prime minister from the party who has the majority. But if he does not do it, if the president does not do it, obviously there will be a blockage at the assembly and it will be impossible to govern. It will be impossible to vote any law. So the jurisprudence, the practice is that the president appoints a prime minister from the party who gets or the absolute majority or the what we call the relative majority at the assembly. So they are able to govern, and the assembly above all will not do any or will do less blockage that if the president refuses to follow the opinion of the people. And also from the citizens' point of view, obviously no one would understand that the president appoints a government that is not aligned with what French people have voted.
Let's look at the results from the weekend in more detail now. The country's far right is in pole position. The projected results have been described as historic. Could you put simply for us what the election results have shown, how the major parties have performed, and whether you subscribe to the view that it's a historic result?
The first thing I want to say is that, yes, it's obviously a historical result and score for the far right, for the party of Marine Le Pen, the National Rally, but it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise for different reasons. I would say like three main reasons. First thing, the far right get more or less 30%, a bit more than 30, 1/3 of the French votes over the weekend. It's not a surprise for three reasons. The first one is we had European election now 3 weeks ago, and the results of the far right were already extremely high, and they get first also at the European election with approximately the same score. So it's quite logical that if you ask citizens to go back voting 3 weeks later, they are going to vote for the same party they have voted 3 weeks earlier. So that's not a surprise for that. Second thing, it's not a surprise that the far right is so high because it was announced, it was calculated by all the latest polls in France in the last couple of years. Whatever the survey or polls institute was, the far right was given as the big winner with also kind of same score in the last couple of weeks and months in the different polls. So it was expected. The third reason, which is for me probably more important, it's not a surprise to discover that the far right is so high in France in this legislative election, because in fact, since 22 and since the first time that the far right get to the second round of the presidential election, when he was the father of Marine Le Pen, Jean-Marie Le Pen, against Jacques Chirac at the 2002 election, since this date, the score of the far right gets better and better from one election to another. And just to give you an idea, 22 years ago, at the second round of the presidential election, the far right obtained 12% against Jacques Chirac, who get 88%. 12%. 2 years ago, the far right get almost at the second round 45% against 55 for Emmanuel Macron. So it means that the far right just increased its score from one election to another election since more than 20 years now. So that's the first thing. It's a victory for the far right this election, but it's not a surprise. The second thing is the far left. The far left, by opposition to the far right at this election, the far right is only one party. It's a party of Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella, the National Rally. The far left/left is a coalition, in fact, of almost 9 different parties, from the classic socialist party to the more anti-capitalist party, but also the Communist Party, the Greens. So it's already a coalition of different parties. And they also get, in fact, a good score of more or less 27%, which once again is quite aligned if you do the math and you have a look at the European election. If you do the math of the different party that gets to the European election, if you add all the scores, it's also quite relevant and logical with what we observed 3 weeks ago. The thing with the far left alliance will be I would say it's a struggle of power between the different components to see which one will lead the group at the next legislative election. But once again, it's also not a surprise because it's an alliance and because it was the score at the European election. And then this is where we have, I would say, more unexpected things happening with, in third position, the party of Emmanuel Macron, Renaissance. If you have a look, in fact, Renaissance resisted more than expected for this legislative election. Emmanuel Macron didn't get a better, I would say, he won't get a better majority just by himself at this legislative election, but his party did not collapse. And that will be very interesting to see what will happen for the second round of the election, to see if he can maintain a decent number of MPs for the next parliament assembly. Why? Because if he gets a decent number of MPs, he will be also able to lead and to build a coalition with other, I would say, more classic and centrist party. And then if you have a look at the other parties, you can see that, in fact, they are still very, very minor in the political game in France. The classic right, for example, still has to rebuild something. They won't get it through this election. They have also internal struggles because some wanted to ally directly with the National Rally, some wanted to go by themselves, but still they won't get a very high score. So it means that their group at the National Assembly will also be quite non-powerful. And then you have just like a few like minor parties who will not even get a group, because to get a group at the National Assembly in France, you have to have at least 15 MEPs to be able to form a group. So if you just have 3 or 4 MEPs, for example, you won't be able to have a proper group and you have to ally with other political parties. So I would say, in a nutshell, not a surprise for the far left, not a surprise for the far right, and Macron's group resisted more than expected, and the right still has not rebuilt itself from the previous elections.
Following on from the projected results from last weekend, Emmanuel Macron, and I quote, said, not one more vote for the far right. He's obviously calling on a block of anti-far right electorate to come out and vote and stop a majority of the far right. Is this likely to be successful? Are we likely to see a sudden energy and motivation of center left electors saying, okay, this threat is real, we're going to come out and somewhat reduce the majority that the far right might have after second round of voting?
It's a very, very important question, and it's a very complicated question to answer at the moment. Why? Because, in fact, one of the Macron's idea when he said, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, when he said right and classic right and classic left are not relevant anymore, we have to find something else. One of the reasons he did that is it was also to say that I will also be the one to fight against the far right and to prevent the far right from accessing the power. If you have a look, a couple of years ago, before Macron goes to the presidency, there were only 2. It was under François Hollande government. So in 2012, there were only 2 far-right MEPs at the National Assembly, 2 out of 577 MEPs. With Macron already 5 years ago or 7 years ago now, The number of far-right MEPs was 88. 88 out of 577. Now with the projection, the far-right may have, it's hard to say exactly, but may have between 240, some projections even give the absolute majority, and 300 MEPs out of 577. So it means that, in fact, the strategy of Emmanuel Macron to try to prevent the far right from accessing the power in France is a failure. And I'm saying that it means that when Macron calls for no one vote for the far right, a lot of French citizens are wondering, but what have you done yourself to prevent that from happening? And how could you be relevant in saying that and in telling me why I shouldn't give a vote to the far right? So yes, he did this call, which is kind of a historical call in France. Usually what happens when you have this situation with, let's say, a candidate from right against a candidate from far right, the left historically called to give your vote to the right. And the opposite is true too. If you have a candidate from left against far right, the candidate from right calls you to vote for the left. So you don't have any single vote that goes to the far right. But once again, with what happened with the progression, the evolution of the far right under Emmanuel Macron's presidency, I think the guidelines given by the president, not one single vote to the far right, will be less listened by the French citizens that it used to be. And also because probably it's not just the case in France, but everywhere, citizens like less and less being told for who to vote, because that's also the principle of the vote in a free country, is to elect whoever you want, even if it does not make, I would say, the president happy.
What is it, Nat, about the far right that you think has allowed it to garner so many votes? I mean, the National Rally obviously campaigned heavily on an anti-immigration rhetoric. What is it about this policy in the far right persuasion in France, do you think, that clearly voters were so in favor of?
So I think we have to make a little bit of history with the far right. The far right in France, when Jean-Marie Le Pen created it in the 70s, historically the far right has been founded by former Nazi. So it's really like an extreme right, far right party. But obviously, the more and more you get far from this period of time, the less and less you have people who have been confronted to this period, and the new political leaders in the far right obviously do not have any responsibility with what happened during the Second World War. So that's the first thing, the fact that you don't have today the person who have created this party leading this party. Obviously you can't just use this argument, you can't just use this aspect of it has been created by former Nazi in France. That's the first thing. The second thing is also Marine Le Pen, when she took the lead of the far right of the National Rally, also created an ecosystem that is more acceptable by French citizens. She modernized, in fact, the party. I just give you one example. Even a couple of years ago, 1 or 2 decades ago, one of the things of the far right was to exit Europe if you want to do a Frexit. If you have a look at today, the question is not for the far right to exit Europe. It's not something that they promote. So even on this question where it was really in the DNA of the far right to be, anti-Europe, exiting Europe, it's not the case anymore. In a certain way, the far right took some positions that are more centrist that it used to be. So that's the first thing, the proper evolution of the far right. And the second thing that explained this success is I would say, a classic thing in democracy, when citizens try left and they think it doesn't work, after they try right and they think it doesn't work neither, maybe they can try a little bit left again and a little bit right again. But at some point, in fact, citizens want also to try things that they haven't never tested in the past. And I think that's why it explains not just the fact that the far right gets so good score at this election, but this explains why there was a progressive increase of the far right in the last 20 years. So that's the second thing. And the third thing I would say, it's if you have a look at the EU picture at the moment, the French case is not an isolated case, and you can see an increase of far-right political parties all across Europe, in Hungary, obviously, historically with Orban, but also in Italy with Meloni, in Germany with the comeback to the assembly of the extreme right party, the AfD. Some movement is also in Slovakia, Portugal. So you can really see this increase of far-right parties all across EU at the moment.
There's plenty of talk in the media, and analysts are predicting hung parliament after this weekend. What does a hung parliament mean for, in particular, the National Rally, and what role are they likely to then play in the new parliament? Will they be the kingmakers on various different policies? What does this all mean?
So in France, to be able to leading the parliament, you have to have the absolute majority. So it means 289 MEPs elected from your own party. So this information, we do not have it at the moment, but it will be very important to follow if the National Rally is able to get this absolute majority to be able to make and vote the law by themselves without the need and the support of other party. And it's probably even more important for the National Rally because we know that they will not get a lot of compromises, a lot of agreements with other political groups. So that it's really important for them to have as many MEPs as possible. When you are when you have this majority at the parliament, obviously, like in any parliament, every law is discussed between the different groups. But if you have the majority, you are able to vote this law. What happens in France, if it's a system with two chambers, the National Assembly and the Senate. When a text is voted by the National Assembly, after it goes to the Senate, and the Senate also has to vote for this text. So at the moment also, it's important to understand that in France, the role of the Senate will be very important because if we elect a parliament with a majority of National Rally MEPs, and if they vote law that, for example, are considered as anti-democratic, the Senate will still have his word to say. And if the Senate does not agree, in a sense, with the law, it goes back to the National Assembly. The National Assembly, after, has to discuss, transform the law, goes back to the Senate, and ultimately, it's what we call, and sorry, I will call it in French because it's called a commission mixte paritaire, meaning that you have a commission with some people from the Senate and some people from the National Assembly to ultimately vote this law and have a text that after can be applied. But it means that the Senate will really play this role also of counterpower if the National Assembly has a majority of National Rally MEPs. What can happen also in France is you have two types, I would say, of laws. You have the laws that are discussed by the National Assembly, that are voted by the National Assembly, but you can have also some laws that are directly, in a sense, brought by the government. It's much less democratic, but it's also a power that you give by electing the president and himself, by appointing a prime minister and a government. The whole thing is in the balance. If a French government only uses this power of voting law without the assembly, it will not work because French citizens will not be happy with that. And that's also something that Macron was very criticized in the last couple of years. He probably overused the capacity of the government to vote law. It's not voting law, but to create law in a sense without going through the parliament. And probably also people were a little bit fed up that he overused this. Usually you do that when you have to have an important law, timely sensitive, and you are not sure to get the parliament to support it, but you can't do that too often. And once again, probably Macron overused his power as a president to do that. So that's why it will be also very important to see, because if Macron is president, how will he do with this power, while a National Assembly will probably be completely against him if they are if the majority is for the National Rally.
What implications do you think that this will have for France's dealings with the rest of Europe and the rest of the world?
So once again, in politics, like in in sport, timing is everything. And at the moment, in fact, in Europe, you have like different countries take turns in terms of, in a sense, like leading Europe and being the head of Europe for a couple of for 6 months. And at the moment, in fact, it's the turn of Viktor Orban and Hungary to have it. It's a very kind of democratic system when like each country has a different institution, like also this lead. So when I say timing is everything, is obviously if Marine Le Pen sends and Jordan Bardella send the majority of National Rally MEPs, and if at the moment the head, I would say, of Europe will be Viktor Orban for a couple of months, obviously it's a good timing for France, and there is no reason that there will be blockages for France at the EU level. Also, another thing, like I think very important to understand for people who listen to us, is that in fact today a lot of laws that are voted by the French Parliament, and it's also the case for other parliaments in Europe, are only what we could call translations of laws by EU lawmakers. So what happens is you have the EU Parliament that is voting a law, and then this law is brought to a national parliament, and they vote about this law by adapting this law to the local context with the local laws and legislation. So why I'm saying that? I'm saying that because it means at the end of the day, the lawmakers in France, the MEPs, wherever they come from, the lawmakers, in fact, also are using the legislation that EU has voted. So the margin of maneuver also of the French MEPs is not completely free, because they also have to adapt these EU laws that have been voted. So that's why I'm thinking, by the fact that the timing with Viktor Orban, by the fact that French MEPs at the end of the day also use a lot of EU legislation, but also by the fact that the project of Marine Le Pen is not to exit EU anymore. By the three different things, I think also that the situation may be, I would say, less dramatic than expected for France and its EU counterparts, even if a national rally majority is elected at the French Parliament in 1 week.
And Nat, we usually put our guests on the spot on Put Simply, and we ask for a prediction. So I'm going to ask you what your prediction is for this weekend in terms of the election outcome, but also, perhaps more importantly for some of our listeners, who will win out of France and Portugal. And by the way, congratulations on France's victory against Belgium last night. But yeah, if you could give us your projections on these two very important things coming up, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So I'm not reading in the crystal balls, but I would say for EU, it's not only that we are going to beat Portugal. I think we are going to win the EU. We are going to win the Euro.
These are bold predictions.
Yeah, no, probably like France will wake up and will score proper goals, not just benefit from own goals for other teams. That's my prediction. At least that's my wish. And for this weekend results, it's very hard to predict. Also, for the first reason is we discussed also a couple of parties that historically say, I don't want to take the risk that the National Rally to be elected. So I'm withdrawing my candidacy, because if another Democratic Party is in a better place for me to beat and to fight against the National Rally, I prefer this party to be elected. And as I said, in fact, I don't know how the political parties will do regarding this, I would say, this habit that we had in the French politics. But also, it's very hard to say how people will react to this classic guidelines given by the party, because once again, I think people like less and less to be told what to vote. But what it's very clear for me, and I'm not taking a lot of risk, is that yes, the National Rally will win this election. Now the real question is, will they have this absolute majority of more than 289 MEPs elected, or will they have a little bit less than this absolute majority, meaning that they will have to compose with another political party? And in this case, the worst case scenario is that they don't manage to get an alliance at the parliament, and we will be in a situation where no one will have a majority, or by themselves or with an alliance. And in this case, the risk is that we have a situation of blockage, and the parliament is not able to vote a single law. Meaning what? Meaning that the president will use this power of passing laws, which will make people even more unhappy, because as we said that during this interview, President Macron was doing that probably more than his predecessors. And this is something that people do not like. They like the democratic system. So we can still be in a very tricky situation in this case. But my prediction is, National Rally will win this election. Now the question is, in which proportion will they get this majority? And the other thing which I anticipate, and in a certain sense I hope, is that will the different parties that do not belong neither from the far left nor from the far right, will they manage also to form an alliance to be able to have a proper weight against the far right and the far left? So if you take the Renaissance group, Emmanuel Macron's party, if you take the classic right, will they be able, for example, to form a group to be able to also represent people who do not want to be represented by far left and far right? I think from a democratic point of view, it will be also very important that this voice is heard at the next French National Assembly.
Well, Nat, thank you very much. It's been a really interesting and informative conversation. Great to have you on, put simply, and hopefully we'll get you back on to discuss more football and French politics. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a great discussion with both of you.
And that's been this week's episode of Put Simply. Be sure to follow us on LinkedIn at Oroka Group to stay up to date with all the latest episodes and news. Feel free to leave a comment and suggestions on what you'd like to see featured on the podcast as well. Until next time, I'm Erdem Koch.
And I'm Ozan Ibrisim.
Thanks for listening.